their books. They created hedge funds and special investment vehicles that they sold those securities to. And because they were still really part of the bank, when those securities went bad, the bank had to backstop them. And so they ended up back on the bank's balance sheets. They probably should never have left the bank's balance sheets in the first place. They should have been there, visible for people to see that what banks were doing. Then the bank's risk models, of the way that they were looking at risk and pricing risk in these mortgages. And going along with greater oversight is probably going to be greater transparency, the need for some standardization in securities so that they all look a little bit more similar to one another. They're not just completely idiosyncratic products, so that you can actually be a market for these things as opposed to just one-on-one transactions, over-the-counter type transactions. And more incentives to preserve information in the whole process. All right, I'm done.
Jennifer, you want to be the moderator?
Sure.
Just
one who was questions. You were the first one.
Yeah. Obviously, we've become more of a consumer-driven based economy, and because of this, the government has talked about and they've given out these checks, stimulation checks, which in theory would help out with the economy, boost sales in all industries. But the fact is that people would have to go out and spend that money and not just save it. I mean, your feelings on that. So, you get a stimulation check in the mail. They want you to go out and spend it in the economy. But a lot of these people, they're still hold on to it. And
the evidence that I've seen on the last fiscal stimulus, which were these rebate checks that went out in the spring, is that about a third of it got spent. About 2/3 of it got saved or paid down debt. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's in terms of stimulating spending. And in a situation like this, it's not clear that that kind of approach is really going to stimulate spending in a way that's going to kickstart the economy again. I think we are in for a fairly painful reallocation of resources in the economy, and probably somewhat away from spending, and a little bit more to investment and saving rather than spending. So that balance. So there's almost certainly going to be some kind of fiscal stimulus next year, but I only know what I read in the newspaper in that regard. But it seems pretty clear that the new administration is keen on doing something, because really the federal government right now is one of the few players with cash, with money, to actually do something. Businesses are pulling back, credit is tight, and so, but what form that's going to take is something that I think really needs to be debated, because it's not really just sending out a check is going to do much. So,
and Frederick Hayek spoke The Road to Serfdom. He warns about the effects of socialism.
Say that again.
In Frederick Hayek's book The Road to Serfdom, he warns about the effects of socialism, and it just seems like the way our economy is going in our nation, it seems like we're having a more socialist form.
redistribution of wealth.
With the whole General Motors and the Big Three, how the government needs to bail out these companies. I really don't think would that really be in the best interest of the country?
Free market approach.
it is. It's an excellent question as to what are the limits to the role of government in supporting the economy. The U.S. economy has developed into experienced the great growth that it has because it really has pretty much had a hands-off approach, that businesses make mistakes and then they pick themselves up. You know, bankruptcy rates in the U.S. for businesses is really high on a worldwide basis, but they get destroyed and they pick themselves up and they go at it again. And becoming reliant on the government to backstop everything, so that it really creates a moral hazard problem of a systemic nature, because then everybody goes, well, I don't care about being prudent, making good decisions, because I know that I can always get bailed out. So it is a potential dilemma, and it's interesting that you hear the big three automakers, although I'm sure they technically are the big three anymore, but the traditional Detroit ones, you don't hear much coming out of Alabama or Tennessee or Mississippi or stuff from the other automakers in terms of
Mercedes as well.
yeah. Sorry, Jim.
Dr. Bernard.
A couple of things. I was a little curious. You said that the federal government's the only one that has any money to spend right now. Of course, last year they ran a budget deficit of over $450 billion. And obviously next year the budget deficit's going to be vastly greater than that. So in point of fact, they don't have any money to spend other than what they can borrow, or, and this brings me to my next point, what part of their debt they can get monetized. My understanding is that the U.S. Treasury prints that paper money we have, and that the Fed acquires it at 4 cents per unit, whether the unit is a $1 bill or a $100 bill. And then if you look at, you showed the Fed part of their balance sheet, you didn't show the liabilities. And of course, the Fed carries $800 billion roughly of, notes, Federal Reserve notes, as liabilities. How, pray tell, can that be a liability of the Fed? It's an IOU nothing. So really, it belongs below the line as equity, and since that then turns out to be profit, they owe it all to the Treasury. Why don't they pay that to the Treasury as the law requires?
I think that's a conversation I'd love to have with you. Let's have it after this, because we could go on forever about that.
Are you familiar with the Austrian business cycle theory, and what's your criticism of it in regard to this crisis?
No, I'm not. So I couldn't talk with any.
Yeah, on the one slide you had outlining changes that should be coming within the economy and the financial system. One of the things you mentioned was the rating agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think, first, that the rating agencies have pretty much, I think, escaped criticism within the financial press and within, for example, panel hearings in Congress? And how do you expect those to be sort of reformed?
Well, they have done an excellent job at kind of keeping under the radar on this, and they in large part it's about incentives. So it's about setting up the incentive structure in a way where people will behave in what society views as a prudent, responsible manner. And the incentives for rating agencies, because they're very lightly regulated, they don't have somebody looking over their shoulder saying, well, what model are you using to come to this assessment? Really, their credibility is their historical record, that they rate these things and that tends to work out that way. And they got swept up in this housing thing where they really had no experience. Nobody was looking and asking questions. So really it's going to be about oversight and people forcing them to take more responsibility for the ratings that they issue. So I think ultimately, even though that dodged well, it's so far, ultimately, they're going to be called up kind of in front of Congress at some point. John?
Could it be argued that the reason why we have such growth in home prices because of loose monetary policy in the first place, and this is just a hair of a dog kind of thing that the Fed is doing right now?
That is certainly an argument that's been made that low interest rates caused by